Imagine having your Sunday morning interrupted by flashing lights and a sheriff's deputy in your driveway, hand on his holster. All because your homeowners association president decided your beloved pet geese were dangerous weapons. Little did they know, I wasn't just any homeowner they could intimidate. I was chief marshal of the state police with 32 years of experience. How did a simple dispute over farm birds escalate into a showdown that would expose corruption and change our community forever? After 32 years in law enforcement, I finally achieved my dream position as chief marshal of the state police. The job was demanding but rewarding, overseeing operations across the entire state, mentoring young officers, and making our communities safer. But at 58, my wife Sarah and I were ready for a more balanced life, even if full retirement wasn't quite in the cards yet. We purchased our forever home in Lakeview Estates, a peaceful community with spacious properties and friendly neighbors. Our 2-acre lot featured a small natural pond, which immediately caught my eye. Growing up on my grandfather's farm in rural Minnesota, I'd always had a soft spot for waterfowl. This would be perfect for a couple of geese, I told Sarah as we signed the papers. She laughed, knowing I'd been talking about raising birds for years. A month after moving in, I visited Old Miller's farm on the outskirts of town. Harold Miller, a fourth-generation farmer, showed me his prized Chinese geese. Magnificent white birds, with bright orange bills, and surprisingly gentle temperaments. These aren't your typical aggressive geese, Harold explained. Chinese geese are more like dogs if you raise them right. Loyal, smart, and they'll let you know when strangers are around. I brought home a pair. Bonnie and Clyde, we called them. Within weeks, they became more like pets than livestock, following me around the yard and greeting visitors with curious honks. Our neighbors took to them immediately. The Johnsons next door brought their grandchildren over on weekends to feed them. Mr. Henderson, the 72-year-old Vietnam veteran on our right, would sit by the fence watching them for hours. Those birds remind me of my grandfather's farm back in Missouri, he told me one evening, his eyes distant with memory. Before the war, before everything changed. There's something peaceful about them, isn't there? He was right. After decades of police sirens, crime scenes, and the constant tension of law enforcement, the gentle honking of geese and the rhythm of rural life became my daily therapy. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking at every sound. Little did I know that our peaceful pond and its feathered inhabitants would soon become the center of a neighborhood battle that would challenge everything I'd learned about community policing. 6 months into our peaceful existence, everything changed when Eleanor Pritchard was elected as the new HOA president. I'd skipped the meeting, taking my granddaughter fishing that day, a decision I'd soon regret. The first time I saw Eleanor was at the community mailboxes. Mid-50s, impeccably dressed in a designer pantsuit, she was instructing a landscaper about the proper height for the communal hedges while checking her watch repeatedly. "You must be Thomas Reynolds," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I've heard about your rural additions to the neighborhood." Before I could respond, she handed me an envelope. "Just some community guidelines to review. We're working to maintain certain standards here at Lakeview." The letter inside was printed on crisp HOA letterhead. Livestock and poultry are prohibited under Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the Community Bylaws. It was signed Eleanor Pritchard, President, Lakeview Estates, HOA, with her law firm credentials listed prominently below. I drafted a polite response the same day, highlighting that my geese were pets, not livestock, and specifically excluded under the pet provisions allowing for traditional and non-traditional pets that do not exceed 25 pounds. 3 more letters followed over the next month, each more threatening than the last. The final one mentioned legal remedies available to the association and compulsory removal of non-compliant animals. I began noticing Eleanor's silver Mercedes driving slowly past our property daily. Sometimes she would stop, take photos with her phone, and make notes. At the monthly HOA meeting, I finally attended, hoping to resolve the issue face to face. Eleanor had prepared a slideshow titled Threats to Our Community Standards. Half the presentation featured close-up images of my geese and their droppings. "These are not ordinary pets," she told the 24 residents in attendance. "They're aggressive wildlife that violate the aesthetic harmony of our community." When I attempted to speak, she interrupted. "Mr. Reynolds, the board has already ruled on this matter." "What board?" I asked, looking around the room. "I thought decisions required a community vote." Eleanor smiled thinly. "The executive committee made an emergency ruling for efficiency." On my way out, Mrs. Wilkinson, who'd lived in Lakeview for 20 years, whispered, "She's done this before, dear. Her last neighborhood had some kind of class action suit against her. Be careful." The next day, a certified letter arrived demanding documentation of exotic pet permits and proof of liability insurance coverage for potentially aggressive animals. The battle lines were drawn, and Eleanor had no idea who she was dealing with. The situation intensified in early spring, when Bonnie and Clyde had goslings. 4 fuzzy yellow babies joined our backyard family, instantly becoming the highlight of my granddaughter's weekend visits. "Grandpa, can we name them after the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles?" she asked, delighted as they waddled behind their parents. Now a family of 6 geese wandered our property. They remained friendly with familiar faces, but, like any protective parents, became more vocal when strangers approached. Nothing aggressive, just natural, protective behavior. Eleanor seized on this immediately. Within days, fluorescent orange flyers appeared on every mailbox and community bulletin board. "Danger! Aggressive attack! Geese at 1842 Lakeview Drive. Keep children away! Report all incidents to HOA immediately." The phone calls started coming from concerned neighbors. I invited several over to see for themselves, watching as their fear turned to amusement when the vicious attack geese gently ate corn from their hands. But Eleanor was relentless. At the next HOA meeting, she presented incident reports from 3 residents claiming the geese had charged them while they walked past our property. Strangely, these reports came from Eleanor's closest allies in the community, the same 3 people who had recently been appointed to her executive committee. After the meeting, I approached her directly. "Eleanor, this has gone far enough. These are domestic pets, not attack animals. I'm inviting you to come meet them properly." "Those are attack birds and they're a liability," she snapped, her face flushing. "You've trained them as security animals illegally." "That's ridiculous," I replied. "They're just protective of their babies. It's natural behavior." Her eyes narrowed as she leaned closer. "Listen carefully, Mr. Reynolds. This community had standards before people like you moved in. Some of us care about maintaining a certain atmosphere. Either the birds go, or you'll regret it." "Is that a threat?" I asked calmly, my decades of law enforcement experience kicking in. "It's a promise," she replied, walking away. The next morning, an official-looking warning was posted on our front door. Final notice: removal of exotic security animals required within 48 hours. It claimed that the board had unanimously classified our geese as non-domestic security animals, subject to immediate removal. The fine print stated that failure to comply would result in a $200 daily fine and possible legal action. Eleanor's signature was at the bottom, alongside a barely legible stamp reading, "Approved by executive action." That evening, Mr. Henderson came over, visibly upset. "Tom, she's targeting others too. Mrs. Wilkinson got a violation for her bird feeders, and the Johnsons were cited for their children's playground equipment being visually disruptive." I realized this wasn't just about geese anymore. This was about control, intimidation, and one person's vision of what our community should be. Little did Eleanor know, she had picked the wrong retired law enforcement officer to intimidate. Saturday morning dawned clear and beautiful. I was in the backyard teaching my 8-year-old granddaughter Lily how to safely feed the geese, showing her how to hold her palm flat. "They don't have teeth, Grandpa," she asked, giggling as Bonnie gently pecked corn from her hand. "No teeth, sweetheart. Just that rough edge on their bills to grab food," I explained. The moment was interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling into our driveway. Through the fence, I could see 3 vehicles: a sheriff's cruiser with lights silently flashing, Eleanor's silver Mercedes, and a white van marked County Animal Control. "Lily, go inside and tell Grandma we have visitors," I said calmly, not wanting to frighten her. The deputy approached first, young, probably in his 20s, with his hand resting near his holster. His nameplate read, "Officer Davis." I recognized the nervous posture of a rookie trying to appear authoritative. "Sir, we've received multiple complaints about dangerous animals on this property," he said, avoiding eye contact. "I'll need to speak with the homeowner." "That would be me," I replied evenly. "Thomas Reynolds." Eleanor emerged from her car in a tailored navy pantsuit, standing behind the officer with arms crossed and a triumphant smile. The animal control officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, approached cautiously, clipboard in hand. "Those attack geese have been terrorizing this neighborhood for months," Eleanor announced loudly, projecting her voice like she was in a courtroom. "They're a danger to children and the elderly. I've documented 17 separate incidents where they've charged at innocent passers-by." The animal control officer frowned, looking past me to where Lily had returned and was now petting Bonnie's head while the goose sat contentedly. "Sir," Officer Davis continued, "we've received reports that these birds are being used as guard animals, similar to attack dogs. Is that correct?" "Of course not," I replied. "They're domestic Chinese geese kept as pets. May I see the complaint, please?" He handed me a form filled with alarming claims. Trained attack, geese patrolling property perimeter. Aggressive birds charging at community members. Owner refuses to comply with safety regulations after multiple warnings. "Officer Davis, do these look like attack animals to you?" I asked, gesturing to where my granddaughter was now sitting cross-legged with geese gathered around her. Eleanor stepped forward, pointing accusingly. "Don't be fooled. He's trained them to be docile around family members. They're guard animals. They nearly took my arm off yesterday when I was simply placing a violation notice on his door." The animal control officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, I don't see any injuries on your arm." "I managed to escape just in time," Eleanor huffed. "I've been handling dangerous animal complaints for 20 years, and these are clearly—" "Actually," the animal control officer interrupted, "I've been handling dangerous animal complaints for 20 years, and these appear to be standard domestic geese." Officer Davis cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sir, I'm still going to need to see some identification, and we'll need to assess these animals for dangerous behaviors." "Of course, officer. I understand you're doing your job." I turned to my granddaughter. "Lily, please take the geese back to the pond while I talk to these folks." I went inside, retrieving my wallet from the kitchen counter. Sarah gave me a concerned look. "Should I call anyone?" she whispered. "No need," I replied with a slight smile. "This won't take long." Back outside, I handed Officer Davis my driver's license, along with my other ID, the one identifying me as Chief Marshal Thomas Reynolds, head of the state police. The change in the young officer's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His eyes widened, posture straightening as he suddenly recognized who I was. "Chief Reynolds, I wasn't aware this was your residence, sir," he stammered, his face flushing red. Eleanor, still oblivious to the shifting dynamic, pushed forward. "That doesn't matter who he is. The HOA regulations clearly state—" "Ma'am," Officer Davis interrupted firmly, "I'm going to need you to step back to your vehicle while I handle this professionally." As Eleanor's expression changed from triumphant to confused, I realized this confrontation was about to take a very unexpected turn. Officer Davis handed back my identification with newfound respect. "I apologize for the confusion, Chief Reynolds. Had I known who you were—" "No apology necessary, officer," I assured him. "You're responding to a complaint as you should. I would have done the same." Eleanor, still standing beside her Mercedes, looked bewildered as she watched our exchange. "What's happening? Why are you apologizing to him?" The animal control officer approached the geese, who were now swimming peacefully in the pond. "These birds show no signs of specialized training or aggressive tendencies. They're standard domestic Chinese geese." She made notes on her clipboard. "In fact, they appear better behaved than most I encounter." Eleanor marched forward, her heels digging into my lawn. "This is absurd. I've filed formal complaints. Those geese attacked me yesterday. I have witnesses." "Ma'am," Officer Davis said firmly, "falsifying reports to law enforcement is a serious offense." "Falsifying? How dare you?" Eleanor's voice rose. "Do you know who I am? I was senior partner at Pritchard and Associates for 15 years before being asked to leave the firm due to client complaints," I interjected calmly. "Yes, I'm aware of your background, Ms. Pritchard." Her face paled. "How could you possibly?" "I still have friends in the legal community," I explained. "When you began targeting my family, I did my homework. Standard procedure." Officer Davis shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, given the circumstances, would you like to file a harassment complaint? This appears to be a pattern of behavior rather than a legitimate animal control issue." "Actually," I said, "I'm concerned there might be more to this situation. Would you mind running Ms. Pritchard's name through your system? There seems to be a pattern here that extends beyond my property." Eleanor's composure cracked visibly. "That's completely unnecessary and inappropriate. I'm acting in my official capacity as HOA president." "It'll just take a moment," Officer Davis replied, returning to his cruiser. The animal control officer continued examining the geese from a respectful distance. "Mr. Reynolds, these birds are in excellent health. I wish all the animals I checked on were this well cared for." Eleanor paced nervously, checking her phone repeatedly as Officer Davis spoke into his radio. My granddaughter watched curiously from the porch steps. When the young officer returned, his expression was serious. "Ms. Pritchard, are you aware that there are 3 outstanding complaints filed against you for harassment from former neighbors at your previous residence?" "Those were misunderstandings," she stammered. "Vindictive people who—" "And," he continued, "there's also a pending investigation for HOA fund misappropriation here in Lakeview Estates." This was news even to me. Eleanor's face cycled through shock, anger, and fear. "Who would dare make such accusations?" she demanded. "The treasurer of your HOA board, ma'am," Officer Davis replied calmly. "Mr. Gonzalez came into the station yesterday with documentation of some concerning financial discrepancies in the association accounts." "Raphael?" "But he's on my executive committee." Eleanor's voice cracked with betrayal. "Yes, ma'am. He mentioned being particularly concerned about an $18,000 withdrawal for what was listed as office renovations, but appeared to coincide with your bathroom remodeling project." My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, had appeared at his fence, watching the scene unfold with undisguised satisfaction. Several other neighbors had also emerged from their homes, drawn by the sheriff's car, and raised voices. "This is all a misunderstanding," Eleanor insisted, her confident demeanor completely evaporated. "The board approved those expenditures." "The board that consists of you, your sister-in-law, and your bridge partner?" I asked quietly. Officer Davis closed his notebook. "Ms. Pritchard, I'm not here to investigate HOA matters, but I would strongly advise you to refrain from further contact with Mr. Reynolds or his property. Any additional complaints about these animals without clear evidence of dangerous behavior could result in charges of filing false reports. As Eleanor retreated to her car, her face ashen, I realized this confrontation had just exposed something much bigger than a dispute over geese. By Sunday evening, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Word had spread through Lakeview Estates like wildfire about the confrontation in my driveway. After the fifth call, Sarah joked that we should have set up a hotline. "Tom, you won't believe what she did to us," said Martin Craig, a retired firefighter from 2 streets over. His voice trembled with indignation. After I questioned the landscaping fee increase, she sent 3 violation notices about our basketball hoop being 3 inches above regulation height. My grandson loves that hoop. The Jacobsons called next. We voted against her security camera proposal, the ones that would face every driveway. And suddenly, our garden gnomes violated the aesthetic standards of the community. Most heartbreaking was Mrs. Wilkinson, a 78-year-old widow who'd lived in Lakeview since the community was built. "She threatened to put a lien on my house, Thomas," her voice quavered. "All because my bird feeders were attracting undesirable wildlife. After Herbert passed away, those cardinals are my only joy some mornings." Each story revealed the same disturbing pattern. Eleanor ruthlessly targeted anyone who questioned her authority or refused to join her community improvement committee, while completely ignoring violations by her friends and allies. By Monday morning, I'd spoken with 23 households, nearly a third of our community. I suggested an emergency meeting at the local library, neutral ground where everyone could speak freely. That evening, over 60 residents packed the library's community room, the largest turnout in the HOA's history. People who had barely exchanged hellos at mailboxes were now sharing stories of intimidation and selective enforcement. I didn't wear my uniform or announce my position. This wasn't about my authority. It was about restoring our community's voice. What we're facing isn't just about geese or garden gnomes or basketball hoops, I explained to the assembled neighbors. It's about the misuse of rules to control rather than to serve. In my career, I've seen how power, even a small amount, can corrupt people who seek it for the wrong reasons. Rafael Gonzalez, the HOA treasurer, stood up next. His hands shook slightly as he distributed copies of financial statements. "I discovered these discrepancies last month," he explained, pointing to highlighted entries. "When I questioned Ms. Pritchard, she threatened to reveal personal information about my family that she claimed to have discovered during a background check she ran on all board members." Gasps filled the room. Running unauthorized background checks crossed a line that even Eleanor's staunchest supporters couldn't defend. The library door swung open, and Eleanor marched in, flanked by her 2 remaining allies on the board. "This is an unauthorized meeting," she announced, scanning the room with obvious shock at the turnout. "Any decisions made here are invalid under Section 12 of the bylaws regarding proper notice for—" Section 12 also states that emergency meetings can be called with 24-hour notice when issues of financial impropriety arise, Raphael countered, holding up his copy of the bylaws. Mr. Henderson stood up then, his military posture unmistakable despite his age. The room fell silent as he walked slowly to the front. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "So people like you couldn't become little dictators in our neighborhoods. Some of us moved here to find peace, not another battlefield." He turned to face the room. "I motion for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president, effective immediately." The vote was unanimous, even including Eleanor's former allies, who suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. As she stormed out, face flushed with humiliation, I caught a glimpse of something I recognized from years in law enforcement. The look of someone whose power had been stripped away, revealing the insecurity that drove them all along. The community I'd chosen for peace had found its voice, and Eleanor Pritchard had severely underestimated her opponents. The community appointed an interim HOA board that evening, with Mr. Henderson as temporary president, and Raphael continuing as treasurer. Their first official act was to commission a full independent audit of the association's finances and records. 3 days later, we gathered again to hear the results. The findings shocked even those of us who had suspected impropriety. The audit revealed multiple financial irregularities, announced Lisa Chen, the certified accountant who conducted the review. She clicked through a presentation displaying highlighted bank statements and receipts. Most concerning is this $18,500 expenditure, labeled as Community Office Improvements. Our investigation found that this exactly matches invoices from Luxury Bath Solutions for work completed at Ms. Pritchard's personal residence. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as she continued. Additionally, we found a pattern of selective fee enforcement. Certain households, primarily those with personal connections to Ms. Pritchard, had their late fees consistently waived without board approval, while others faced aggressive collection tactics for minor delays. But the most disturbing discovery came from Eleanor's HOA email account, which, as president, she had used for official business, making it subject to board review. "We found this document in the sent folder," Raphael said grimly, distributing copies of what appeared to be a strategic plan. The email, sent to Eleanor's sister-in-law, outlined what she called her 5-year community refinement initiative. It detailed plans to gradually force out undesirable elements, including families with young children, elderly residents on fixed incomes, and anyone who didn't fit her vision of an exclusive executive community. One passage particularly stood out. Phase 2 involves strategic enforcement to encourage property turnover. Target households that lack resources to legally challenge violations. Once we've replaced 30% of current residents with the right demographic, we can implement the new fee structure. Mrs. Wilkinson dabbed at her eyes. "So, my bird feeders weren't really the issue. She just wanted me gone, because I'm on a fixed income." "This explains why she was so obsessed with my geese," I added. "They represented a rural element that didn't fit her vision of an exclusive community." Mr. Henderson shook his head sadly. "I've seen this before. People creating arbitrary divisions, deciding who belongs and who doesn't. It's what I fought against overseas, never thinking I'd face it in my own neighborhood." The new interim board proposed updated bylaws that were clearer, fairer, and developed with input from all community members. Reasonable accommodations for pets, gardens, and personal expression were specifically protected, with a new transparency requirement for all HOA financial transactions. "From now on," Mr. Henderson announced, "any resident can request financial statements at any time. Board meetings will be recorded and minutes posted within 48 hours. And most importantly, enforcement actions require documentation and review by multiple board members, never just one person's judgment." As for my geese, they were officially recognized as pets under the revised rules. The community even embraced them as unofficial mascots, with the Activities Committee organizing a spring Meet the Geese Day, where children could safely interact with them under supervision. Eleanor put her house on the market within a month, unable to face her neighbors after her schemes were exposed. Ironically, her real estate agent highlighted the community's charming pond with friendly geese as a selling point in the listing. In my 32 years of law enforcement, I'd seen how power, even a small amount, could corrupt people who craved control over others. But I'd also seen how communities could stand together against injustice when given the chance. What began as a petty dispute over geese had revealed a deeper truth about our neighborhood. The real threat wasn't to property standards, but to the very concept of community itself. The idea that diverse people with different backgrounds and preferences could live together with mutual respect. The geese hadn't divided us after all. In the end, they'd brought us together in ways none of us could have anticipated. The incident transformed Lakeview Estates. What had been a collection of houses with adjacent lawns became a true community where neighbors looked out for one another. Monthly HOA meetings, once sparsely attended, now drew dozens of engaged residents. As summer approached, the board proposed a 4th of July community celebration. Not just fireworks and hot dogs, Mr. Henderson explained, but a recommitment to what makes communities work: mutual respect and shared responsibility. I was asked to give a brief speech at the event. I wasn't in uniform, just a homeowner among neighbors, but the lessons from my career seemed particularly relevant. The day arrived with perfect weather. Tables of potluck dishes stretched across the community green. Children played tag between lawn chairs, while Bonnie, Clyde, and their growing goslings watched curiously from their enclosure near the pond. When it came time to speak, I found myself looking out at faces that had become familiar in recent months. People I now considered friends, rather than just neighbors. In law enforcement, I began, we're given authority to protect and serve. The same should be true of any leadership position. Power isn't about control. It's about responsibility and service. When we forget that, we betray the trust placed in us. I explained how throughout my career, I'd seen that small tyrannies often flourished because good people stayed silent, believing they were powerless or alone in their concerns. Whether it's a police badge, a political office, or an HOA title, any authority can be misused, I continued. The real protection against abuse isn't more rules, but vigilant citizens who speak up and stand together. Several residents shared emotional stories of how they'd initially been afraid to challenge Eleanor, fearing retaliation. Many had quietly suffered, believing they were alone in their frustration, some even considering selling homes they loved. That's exactly how intimidation works, I explained. It isolates people, making them feel powerless and alone. But when communities stand together, that power dissolves like morning mist. The Jacobsons described how their garden gnomes had become an act of defiance. Mrs. Wilkinson shared how her bird feeders weren't just for the cardinals, but connected her to memories of her late husband. What we discovered, I concluded, is that the real measure of a neighborhood isn't uniform lawns or matching mailboxes. It's how we treat each other when things get difficult. It's standing up for your neighbor's garden gnomes today, knowing they'll stand up for your geese tomorrow. Mr. Henderson took the microphone next, his eyes moist with emotion. I watched dictators take over villages in Vietnam, he said. It always starts small, with someone claiming to know what's best for everyone else. Thank you, Tom, for reminding us that freedom requires vigilance, even in our own backyards. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the community green, something remarkable happened. Raphael's teenage daughter began playing her violin, a hobby Eleanor had once tried to suppress through noise restriction bylaws. One by one, other neighbors revealed hidden talents. Mrs. Wilkinson's beautiful soprano voice, Martin's harmonica, the Johnson twins' synchronized dance routine. Our community had been full of beauty and talent all along, just waiting for the freedom to express itself. The celebration continued well into the evening, with impromptu performances and stories shared around patio heaters as the night grew cool. I looked around at my neighbors, diverse in age, background, and lifestyle, and realized we'd learned something profound from our confrontation with petty tyranny. A true community isn't built through rigid enforcement of rules, but through the mutual recognition of each other's humanity and the willingness to stand together against injustice. And sometimes, that lesson comes from the most unexpected sources, like a family of Chinese geese who just wanted to live peacefully by a suburban pond. Today, Lakeview Estates operates differently. The HOA board rotates annually, meetings are well attended, and all decisions are transparent and put to community vote. The geese have multiplied. We're up to 12 now, and they've become a beloved neighborhood fixture. Visitors often comment on the hand-carved wooden sign at our community entrance that reads, "Where neighbors matter more than rules." Beneath it is a smaller sign, "No honking except for geese," a reminder with a deeper meaning about which voices deserve to be heard. The community newsletter, once filled with violation notices and rule reminders, now showcases resident achievements, welcomes new neighbors, and coordinates volunteer initiatives. Last month's feature celebrated Mrs. Wilkinson's 80th birthday, where over 40 neighbors gathered to plant a butterfly garden in her honor. Our annual audit is now a public event, with full financial transparency that has actually improved our community's financial health. With trust restored, residents willingly approved a modest fee increase to build a playground and community garden. Last month, a new family moved into Eleanor's old house. They have 2 young children who spend hours watching the geese. The father, a veteran himself, asked if the HOA would allow them to keep ducks as pets. Mr. Henderson, still serving on the board, just smiled and said, "Under the new bylaws, what brings joy to your family brings strength to our community." As for Eleanor, I heard she moved to a high-rise condo with a strict no pets policy. Last week, she filed a complaint against the building manager for allowing a tenant to keep a service animal on her floor. Some people never learn. I officially retired from the state police last year. These days, my authority extends only to my 6 grandchildren and 12 geese. And honestly, neither group listens to me very well. But when I watch them all playing by the pond, I'm reminded that true security isn't found in rules or control, but in communities where people look out for each other. Sometimes standing up to a bully requires a badge, and sometimes just the courage to speak truth to power. But it always requires neighbors willing to stand together. The sheriff's deputy who showed up that fateful day stops by occasionally, not to issue citations, but to bring bread for the geese and learn a thing or two about real community policing. In law enforcement, we're taught to look for threats. But the biggest threat to our communities isn't always the obvious offender. Sometimes it's the slow erosion of connection, the silent acceptance of petty tyranny, the belief that rules matter more than people. My geese taught me that sometimes the most important policing happens without a badge, when ordinary citizens find their voices and stand together for what's right.